Everyone. Welcome to Channel B. My name is Marianne Rodriguez, pronouns they, them. I am the program manager or the leadership programs manager here at Independent Sector. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping reminders we'd like to share. So the format in this channel is a bit more interactive than Channel A. Instead of it's not a webinar, it's a meeting. So we do encourage everyone to turn on their cameras as we go on today. And also please use the chat box for questions and to engage with other attendees. We love, the back and forth and people sharing. And now I would like to introduce the next workshop, Building Trust to Bridge Divides and Spur Collective Impact. I'm happy to welcome Frederick Riley, Executive Director for Weave at the Aspen Institute. Cary Simmons, Director of Community Strategies at Trust for Public Land. Shaylyn Romney Garrett, co-author with Robert Putnam of the Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And Pedro Silva, Director of Engagement from YOUnify. I'll let them tell you a bit more about themselves. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon to those of you, and if you're on the West Coast, then it's still good morning. My name is Pedro Silva, Director of Engagement at YOUnify, and I am going to be facilitating today. And I want to begin by thanking Independent Sector, our speakers for the plenary. If you missed it, it was a exciting episode or opportunity to engage. The panelists for both breakout sessions, and each and every one of you for attending today's events. By choosing to be in these spaces with us today, you made a vote with your very bodies and being in favor of a world where we know that thriving people and thriving communities can be possible for more people. In our programs at YOUnify, we make connections between education, proximity, and relationships. And I'm not going to get into that today, but suffice it to say, today's programs fall in both of the education and proximity segments. And later, you're going to have the opportunity to expand these elements into the relationship sector through our breakouts and optional post-session exchange facilitated by Dr. Sherry Hall Russell. If you missed the plenary, in that section, we discussed how structural inequities are ingrained within systems and strategies. We talked about insights that were offered into navigating power dynamics that perpetuate inequality, developing deeper understanding of the root causes and their profound impacts on marginalized communities. And we heard how centering equity revolutionizes approaches to systemic transformations. In this session, we're going to look more deeply into the matters of trust and how building trust leads to the relationships that ultimately foster collective impact. As Reverend Jennifer Bailey of the Faith Matters Network once said, social change movements move at the speed of relationship, and relationships move at the speed of trust. So to help us flesh out these connections, I have three insightful panelists, Frederick Riley, Cary Simmons, and Shaylyn Romney Garrett, who were just introduced. And all of these individuals, through learning and life experiences, I've critically and consciously examined what contributes to and deters from trust building. So they're going to kick us off through modeling and weaving their work with stories of why trust is so critical to collective impact. After which, we'll take a few questions from you. So if you do have questions coming up, please put those in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Then we're going to pivot into breakout groups of about 2 to 3 folks, where you'll get the chance to practice the relational elements of trust building. And I know that there's some folks that kind of stop participating when breakouts happen. And if that's you, we honor your choice. However, I do want to remind you that this is both a safe space and a brave space for us to practice. And as a pastor for 10 years, prior to going into full-time bridging work, I never took for granted the trust afforded in my position. But what I wanted more than anything was for every person to be recipients and relayers of trust, to tell their stories and be heard and hear other stories and be transformed. Because it's through the exchange of stories that we see more clearly that we are all woven together in what the often quoted Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So mindful of this, I learned that the gift of these spaces is incalculable. So I do want to encourage you to stick with us for as long as you can to receive what these spaces have to offer, because personal practice directly correlates to collective capacity. So we're going to get started, and I want to start with Cary, primarily because of your work in spaces. So a couple of years ago, I read Priya Parker's book, The Art of Gatherings. And so when I read the green paper from your organization, the Trust for Public Land, that Common Ground framework, I was deeply impressed at the thought given to the strategies you all support based on your research on what makes spaces function as effective social infrastructure. So I just wanted to ask you, what inspired you initially to get into this work?
Thank you, Pedro, and thanks for having me here. In terms of what inspires me, I think a lot of people in America tend to think of parks as luxury amenities, a really nice thing to have near your home, but not a totally critical thing. And most people also tend to think of parks simply for the physical sorts of things that you do there, the sports fields, swings, picnic pavilions, that kind of thing. But in my work at TPL, I know the real superpower of a park is that it can bring people together in a way that almost no other local institution can. It's like truly common ground, like a shared space. It's free, it's accessible, and in the best case, it reflects the community around it and its design and its programming. My personal educational background is in landscape architecture and in forestry. And those things both really trained me around the technical aspects of parks. But in terms of what inspired me, I always think back to a project, the very first project I worked on when I came to TPL. I was the field organizer and designer helping to lead a park renovation in Wenatchee, Washington, rural community in the central part of the state. That's also the center of America's apple industry and one of the West Coast's largest farm worker communities. And as part of the renovation, TPL supported a group of 12 women to organize a community stewardship group to care for the park and program it with activities that serve local farm workers and their children. And the group, it's called Parque Padrinos, or godparents of the park in English. And the Padrinos helped design the park to make sure that all the physical amenities match the needs of the community. But more than that, they use the park to really build a local movement. And what I mean by that is that the process around making decisions, designing the park, it really built strong, durable social connections. And the Padrinos have gone from 12 members when they founded in 2018 to more than 1,100 today in a community of 35,000 people. So it's big. And they're still programming and stewarding their park. But they're also building bridges between their community, between the farm worker community and the Latino community, and communities outside their neighborhood with government, healthcare, all sorts of other stakeholders who hadn't been connected before. So to me, their work is really inspirational, and it really shows what social infrastructure looks like in practice.
I'm never going to look at parks the same way. When I usually go to parks, I know my kids always, let's go to the park, let's go to the park. But now that I hear you speaking in this way, it reminds me of all the impactful things culturally that happened for me. Like, I grew up celebrating Juneteenth, which just passed. Oh, it's just yesterday. I grew up with Juneteenth, and it was at parks. There was like cultural exchanges and all sorts of things that happened. So I can see through what you're shared that it can actually help combat polarization and what some people call the loneliness epidemic. So just briefly, what is it about parks and green spaces that makes them ideal containers for building trust and social connections?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, if you're not familiar, the Surgeon General recently released an advisory that's calling out loneliness in America as a true health risk and health pandemic. And that feeling lonely is as bad for your health as smoking a pack of cigarettes every day. And in the advisory, the Surgeon General really calls out the need to address the sort of social determinants of loneliness, the sort of social and economic and cultural disparities that play a part. And, parks and green spaces play a huge role in bridging divides and helping people reflect their identity in shared spaces, and really serving as sort of neutral common ground. Parks can bring people together from really diverse backgrounds in a way that promotes understanding and empathy between groups. So you mentioned our paper. We recently published the Common Ground Framework, which emphasizes the importance of community engagement processes in parks that create opportunities for community dialogue, and thinking about how to strategically design parks in a way that reflects cultural diversity. It's a really durable solution to create unity, to break down barriers that contribute to the loneliness that the Surgeon General posted about.
Awesome. Thanks, Cary. And listening to you, it also kind of reminds me of your work, Shaylyn, and especially the book that you did with Robert Putnam, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And, when I was going through the book, I was obviously wasn't living a century ago, but I did think to myself, like, what if we just kept that going? Like, what would the world look like if we could have kept that in the question of, can we do it again? And imagining the spaces that Cary talked about, I could just see America being what it truly is, which is a tapestry woven of so many different people, cultures, and all those things. But we've lost sight of that. If that space that Cary's talked about could just spread everywhere, it would be amazing. But I just wanted to ask you, and your expertise, do you believe that we can heal this nation's many divides? You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pedro, for having me here. And thanks for that question, because it's not a small question, right? Do you believe that we can heal these divides? But the answer is that I absolutely do, for a number of reasons. But one of them is actually because we've done it once before as a nation, right? And that's really the history of the upswing. Just very briefly, the upswing looks at statistical data tracking trends over time, over the last 125 years in American history, basically asking the question, how did we get here into this multifaceted crisis where we are divided in every possible way, economically, socially, physically, geographically, in all of these ways? Have we always been this way? And if not, have we moved, in a better direction at different periods of time? And what that data really looks like is what we see is that during the last Gilded Age, basically in the late 1800s, America looked, from a statistical perspective, almost identical to what it looks like today in terms of polarization, in terms of income inequality, in terms of our unraveled social fabric, and also in terms of a culture that was really self-centered and narcissistic, much like we see today. And just like today, back then, social commentators were sort of decrying the end of democracy and asking this same question that you're asking: can we heal our divides? And a lot of people were saying, no, I don't think we can. I think democracy has failed. And so that's something that we're hearing today. It's definitely something that we were hearing back in the 1800s. But what's so fascinating about that history is that democracy didn't fail. America didn't go off the rails. On the contrary, we entered a multi-decade, multifaceted upswing in which all of those measures of polarization, inequality, social dislocation, isolation, loneliness, they all started moving in a better direction and continued moving in a positive direction for something like 70 years. And then, unfortunately, in the 1960s, all of those measures took a downward dive. And we've fallen right back down over the last half century. We've proceeded to slide back to right where we were 125 years ago. And so the question really is, is there hope? Well, I definitely think that there is, because we've been here once before and we overcame those divides once. Now, we didn't do it perfectly. We didn't overcome every single divide. We definitely kicked the question of racial reconciliation down the road, and a lot of gender discrimination persisted through the 20th century, as we know. I mean, these are things that a lot of those problems were not solved, but through hard measures, we were able to overcome our political polarization and economic divides. Now, what's so fascinating about that is how we did it. And as Cary was speaking, this is what came to mind for me. A lot of the public lands that we experience today, a lot of the playgrounds, for example, they actually were invented during the decades after the Gilded Age. They were actually invented as strategies to overcome these very problems that we faced once before. So it actually, exactly what Cary is talking about, we have the data to prove that it worked. That and other strategies that were implemented by, thousands of different diverse Americans across many sectors in this society, it actually worked to bring us together, and it can work again.
I never heard of the I curve until I got into your book a little bit. And it was for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it was if you look at a bell curve, it was I, then it went the we, then it went right back into I. And I kind of started wondering what do you think it would take for a critical mass of us to find the unifying threads that bring us all together? Because in one of your commentaries, you talked about the war of the we's and how sometimes even in the work that we do in these spaces, we kind of have a hard time figuring out what brings us together. So, what do you think it would take for another critical mass to assemble and then to keep going in that positive trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the title of this plenary, or excuse me, the title of this breakout is about trust and also about collective action, right? And what we see is that there's no shortage of collective action. It's my collective action versus your collective action, right? That's what we're seeing right now. And so the question is, how do we create something that is collective action where we're all moving toward the same goal, right? And I do think that during the progressive era, one thing that we see in the data is that it wasn't political change that happened first. It wasn't economic change that happened first. It was actually cultural change that happened first. And so what began to happen was that people began to question the underlying cultural values of the Gilded Age. And through that sort of soul searching, in a way, they were able to develop this idea of needing to move away from competition and toward collaboration. And that looked different for all sorts of different groups that were working independently, but they were all sort of animated by this unifying spirit of join or die, basically, right? Like we have to come together and solve our problems together. And so I think sometimes today, when we look at collective action, the underlying assumption of collective action is that our solutions are going to be political, right? And so what that means is that, if I'm part of a group that's advocating for X, Y, or Z policy change, my belief is that if I get that policy change in place, that's what's going to change America, right? But I actually think that our history tells us that that's not really true, that we can change our policies, we can change our laws, we can change our economic systems, but if we haven't done the heart work, the cultural work underneath that, those things can unravel really easily. And in a way, that's the story of the I century. We did change a lot of things on the surface of our country, but particularly when it comes to race, for example, we never did the actual heart level bridge building. And so as a result, we passed the civil rights legislation, but then subsequently, within minutes experienced a huge white backlash to that thing that we supposedly were all on board with. And we see the results of that unfolding over the last half century or more, right? And so I think that the biggest thing we need to do is figure out how to get underneath all of our debates about politics and policy and economic solutions and ask ourselves what we're really about. Is this a nation that's based on an ethic of competition? Or is it collaboration? Or is there a balance that needs to be struck between those two things? What is the balance between I and we? And how can we find that again?
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm getting, as I said, I used to be a pastor and I used to try to get people excited, and you guys are getting me excited just thinking about how these pieces are coming together. And I will say that you probably be good at making a t-shirt signs. You could do the join or die t-shirt and then the do the heart work t-shirt. So if you start making money at that, my commission will be small. But this is like, now I want to go to Frederick, because I feel like the work that you're doing is like really, identifying the folks who are doing the hard work, who have come to those realizations of, we have to make this work. We have to get this awareness lifted up in our own inner being and then putting that out into the world through what you do at Weave. And I know that you've had national and local scope through your previous work in the YMCA. And then now here at Weave, you've been identifying folks that you call trust brokers, which is also a very t-shirt worthy, awesome name. If somebody say I'm a trust broker, I would love to ask you, how do you all at Weave identify the trust brokers that we need to bring all of these elements into fruition?
Yeah. So first, Pedro, thank you so much. And I could listen to Shaylyn talk all day because it's so close to the work that we do at Weave, and you should come back and join us. But we believe that trust is at the core of all of our nation's issues. I have to say that first. People won't tap into systems. They won't talk to their neighbors. They won't do anything without trust. And so trust has to be at the center of all the work that we're doing nationally. You know, we believe, you know, I read a lot. And so Shaylyn, you said we've been here before, and we've been here before a couple of times, right? At the YMCA after World War II, it was local leaders who taught English to new Americans and helped soldiers who were returning home and helped families on the grief journey. And so our country has been here before as it related to trust. And I want you to think about this right now. If you were baking a cake at home and you ran out of sugar, there was a time, and I was a kid and I grew up in the projects, you'd go knock on your neighbor's door and say, can you loan me a cup of sugar? Now, what do? You go to a food delivery service and you have sugar at your house in an hour versus trusting that your neighbor would give you. We have to get back to that. And so what we do at Weave, when we first started Weave, we traveled around the country and we found those people who would go knock on their door, giving away sugar. These are the people who show up for their neighborhood because they believe that if we serve together and if we work together and if we know our neighbors and if we do the hard work in our community, it's going to make our communities better. I don't believe that they went out doing this work because they believe they were a trust broker. They did it because they knew they would make their neighborhoods better. And so goes our neighborhood, so go our entire country. And so these folks are the folks who are leaning into the despair that they see and helping an entire neighborhood come together. We see this in New Orleans. We see this in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. We see the folks who lean in because they see that that service together and living together all come together. And we believe that we can bridge divides, but you can't bridge a divide if I don't know you. I won't even talk to you about politics if I don't know you. And it's tough to begin to hate a person once you start to get in relationship with them. And so these are the folks who are sitting at the center, building relationships and doing it through service and the love for their particular community.
Awesome. You know, one of the terms we used to use in the church was like somebody says they feel like they're convicted, like something.
Yeah.
When you're convicted, it hits you and you just know, and you can't not know after that. And
Yeah.
you sound like absolutely convicted when you were sharing, Frederick. So as did everyone. But I just want to ask you in particular, was there, you know, maybe someone in your early life that impacted you, that set you on the trajectory, and you said, hey, you know, whether you had the words for it or not, that brought you to this space of conviction?
Yeah, you know, one of the first trust brokers in my life was my childhood pastor, Reverend Roosevelt Austin. And I realized that he was brokering trust my entire life, right? He was the person that when Jesse Jackson was running for president or when Bill Clinton was running for president, they came into his pulpit and he said, trust me and vote for them. Now, we don't have leaders like that anymore, where people will just like lockstep go out and go trust him. But because of the work that he did, he was the first person to tell me I was important. He was and I thought it was just me, but I realized he was doing this for everybody. But people trusted him so much that his word was his bond. And you went out and you did what he said. If he said, I want everybody to bring back 500 coats so that we can put coats on every kid in the city who doesn't have one, people did it. And so he was the weaver in our city. And I feel like this work that I get to do at Weave and the other work that I've done around the country is paying it forward because of the life that Reverend Austin lived and how he showed up in my life. He showed up in my life in those ways that these weavers are showing up for people in their community. And I just decided to devote my work and my career to paying it forward.
Man, that's awesome. And I know that each and every person here today on the panel and who's listening, who's been on other sessions, have all had someone like that impact in their lives. And I would love to encourage folks to connect with that story inside of yourself and look at ways that you can pay it forward, because something inspired you to be here. And I hope that we can keep adding to that as we go forward. So we're coming to a point in time where we're going to leave a little space for you all to ask questions. I do see that there's one person with their hand raised. And then if there's any questions in the chat, I'm kind of looking out for some questions here. But if you do have questions, please submit them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll go to the first question that I see here. I can't see his name. 1 second. Oded Lerner.
Yeah, that's me.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have some question. You say all the time we. I mean, is we, you mean American? You speak about human being? Because I read lots of articles from progressive people that say we have to diminish our flag, our unity, identity as American, because we're part of humanity. And this for them more important. Does your group, when you say we, you mention American compared to other people like the Russian or the Afghanistan, whatever, or you talk about human being? Can you make it clear?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Does anyone feel called to answer that?
Yeah, I'll jump in and I'll say our work with Weave is primarily based here in the US, but when we say Weave, we mean humankind. I think that the human connection, the things that we center on by just being humans is the work that we try to push forefront, because once we just decide to section us off by borders or by cities or by states or by towns, then I think we've lost the essence of what we do.
I definitely agree with that. And I would also just add, when we're talking about the role of trust and social capital and things like that, when it comes to creating a successful democracy, I mean, one thing that we really know about trust and about social capital is that they're critical components to a successful democracy. And so there is an element of really needing to define who is us in terms of America, simply because being a part of the American democratic experiment is something that has to hold us together amid diversity, right? Just if we're talking about the success of this form of governance called democracy that we're trying to make work in a multicultural setting, right? And so I think that there are different levels on which we could talk about the meaning of we. So I think, on that heart level, I definitely agree with what Frederick is saying, but I think there's also other ways that we can think about it in terms of creating a sense of identity that keeps us together when naturally we might pull apart. Does that make sense?
For me, it's kind of very difficult to say that we trust the Chinese or the Russian or other very bad government to say that part of we. For me, it does not make much of sense. I think to get we is our culture, our democracy is what we are. There's some other people that have different culture, different way of government, and they very feel that they are the we for themselves. So part of human being is let diversity exist. We cannot make a unified human being. We have unified interests or many common interests, but we still have this diversity. And we have to accept it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Oded. I don't think that that diversity is in opposition to a collective and unified we across the planet. Just like when we look at a blanket or just the very word of weaving together things that are different into an inextricable or inescapable garment. They can both, if you look at a patchwork quilt or a mosaic, there are different things in our society that come through our, our creativity and our art that demonstrate that things can both have their own identity and be connected to things that differ. So I would just invite you to meditate on that, and obviously, if you're a part of the mosaic, has this particular point of view, that's also a part of the grand mosaic of which we're a part through relationship. I wanted to lift up a question that's in the chat. It's from Jennifer Juster, and she wanted to know what advice you give to people in coalitions that are working to advance equity, be that race, gender, religion, disability, when they're doing their work in hostile contexts, like states that say, don't say gay, or where racist policies are upheld.
I can take a pass at that. As part of our On Common Ground work at Trust for Public Land, we've recently launched some activations in places that are experiencing political tension. And one of the things about parks and about public spaces that is a really important neutralizer and unifier is that it's a component of a community where everyone is able to relate with a personal experience. You know, most people grew up in a public school where there was a playground. Most people have a favorite tree, potentially childhood memories. And there's a lot of research in the social contact literature that talks about intergroup contact and healthy social contact between groups of opposition, really operating at its best toward empathy building and mutual understanding outcomes when people are recruited to come together around what they have in common, and especially if that recruitment gives people something to do together. So instead of saying, you know, come to this roundtable discussion about political tension, about, you know, the position you bring and you bring, you know, if that's how you're recruited to an event, you're immediately going to come in on your hind legs. And the thing about parks and the thing about these activations that we're testing out in tense communities across the country is that we're really recruiting people around taking care of trees, planting flowers, providing opportunities for children to participate in youth sports. And when people get the opportunity to focus on a shared value and activity together, there's a lot of research that really proves that there's this sort of hidden benefit around empathy building and healthy contact that develops on its own. So I would encourage you to think about what are those sort of core wedge issues that can bring people together, and how do you just invest in more of them, hopefully in a park.
Yeah, I like the little ad, hopefully in a park. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Does anyone else want to take on that question before we lift up one more?
Yeah, I guess I just like to one up Cary and say, yes, you know, we do this thing in our local activations where we call it the story of ourself, where everybody gets an opportunity to write the story of them or a particular prompt question. And what you find through those prompt questions, that we aren't starting with the elephant in the room or the thing that's going to bring us strife. We're starting with these humanity things, and that everybody in the room, and I've seen this done in large crowds or small groups of 4, and everybody begins to see each other as human and not the issue that's at the forefront. And so we have to find a way to bring people to the human issues, and then those other things won't fall by the wayside, but the continual added of the relationship will bring people over to the other side, or will give a greater understanding of the why I feel this way.
Yeah, and I definitely love that story of self. Is really impactful because we've been hearing it a lot in our public lately about narrative. And I think that term is starting to almost become ubiquitous, where there's like narrative and narrative. So I think the more we learn about narrative, starting with our story of ourselves, and then at YOUnify, we teach story of self as well. And then we do story of us, story of now, and then the superordinate story of which we're all a part. And I see some by heads shaking that you all are familiar with that,
No,
framework.
totally. I just want to say, we just had a session in rural North Carolina, and we brought in Todd Brantley, who did a session and said, forget the stats, I want to hear the stories. And he goes, people will rally around stats and they'll point to the stats, but it's not the real story of a community or a place or a people. And so he just encouraged everybody to tell the stories of their town or of themselves, and people will find these connecting points in places. I was connecting with people. I grew up in urban Saginaw, Michigan, and talking to a person in rural North Carolina that I didn't think I had anything in common with, right? This is a red state, a red community, but you find that you have all these things that bind you together. And we are just pushing people to focus on those things versus those things that separate us, because, you know, I don't believe that there's a government policy or an office in DC or a state office or a local mayor's office that's going to connect a community, but it's its people, and it's the commonality and the human existence that we all share that's going to bring us to the other side, this other swing that Shaylyn said we're going to go through.
And Shaylyn, you want to say a final word on that?
I do. I mean, I just think that, you know, we mentioned earlier the idea of doing the heart work first, and that's a nice term, but what Cary and Frederick are actually describing is exactly that's how we do the heart work, right? When we talk about heart work, it's as opposed to head work, right? And oftentimes when we think of advocacy, when we think about collective action, when we think about political work, what we're trying to do is we're trying to persuade people using reason, stats, or whatever it is, right? That this is the right position. This is the better way, right? And we're coming at that from a rational standpoint, right? But as human beings, we need to drop down into that heart space first. It's not that we can't ever have that conversation about the pros and cons of a different policy change or whatever it is, right? But like, we have to get people into that heart space first. And part of that is about getting them into their bodies, getting them into nature, getting them into spaces that feel safe and that feel, and parks are a big one, or the way that we shape a narrative in a room is another way, right? And so once we're able to get people into that heart space, it's often more effective to then have conversations about what we should do and how we should go forward.
Absolutely. So we're about to go into prepare to go into breakout groups. So where people hopefully everything that's been shared so far is hitting you in your heart and your head, and then your head back to your heart, because you're going to have an opportunity to practice. I'm putting in the chat just a link to a shared document that has the breakdown of questions that you can choose from to answer one question. And when you're in the breakout, you'll have about 3 minutes per person to answer one of those questions. And there's also norms in the group, so that in that document, so that we can kind of have a standard for how we're going to hold space in the breakouts together. And then we'll come back and reflect a little bit. And then we want to also invite you to participate in the exchange that will happen in the end. One thing before we set up, and I'm assuming that we're having our breakout rooms getting set up on the back end. So before those, the prompt to go in the breakout room comes up, I wanted to just point out one more thing. I used to be in sales, and we used to say facts tell and stories sell. That was just one of the ways that we framed it. So they would always be like, tell a story about a car. Don't tell them like how many miles to the gallon it gets. You know, those sorts of things. When I sold cars to one of my many jobs. And one of the things I also learned is people practice what they pitch, not just like practice what you preach, but practice what you pitch. What we put out there kind of comes back and it becomes a practice of our lives. And a lot of times in our society, we're kind of taught to have transactional relationships, using people as a means to an end. And these spaces are opportunities to break us out of that tendency for transactional. When you share your story, it's a win-win. And when you hear a story, it's also a win-win.
I left too early. I pushed the button and didn't get to
I did the same thing and I lost my partner.
I guess there's no way back.
I guess there's no way back. We went down the rabbit hole.
I had just been given my turn to speak.
Do you want to share here then, Gloria? If you feel comfortable.
Sure. We were talking about when have you felt completely accepted? And they were giving some very interesting stories, but I joined the Utah Symphony Chorus. And while I like to sing, I didn't like to do solo work, but I could just pull it out there and really feel that resonance of all those different voices, and then be in the orchestra beneath us. Then later, it was just such an exhilarating sense of belonging.
Thank you. We're back, and I wanted to jump off that last word I heard as belonging, and we're about to wrap up, but I wanted to kind of hear from you all, give you a few minutes to debrief and just ask, if anyone wants to share, how did it feel to be in that space with people? Did anything from the panel come with you into your breakout room, anything like that? And we have a few minutes to go in there before we give our panelists a final word. Anyone from a group want to share? If not, I will say that the universe is interesting, because I ended up in a room with another seminarian, another person that went to seminary as I did, and so it was a really interesting to land in that space. I don't want to share their personal conversation because I didn't get a chance to ask permission. But if you want to take yourself off mute and share anything, I invite you to do so. No pressure.
I was just sharing about, so I reversed the second question. When was the time when you felt mostly that you didn't belong? And it was my seminary, when I was in seminary, that I felt most strongly that I didn't belong. And so then we talked about our seminary experiences.
But I really appreciated you taking that initiative and reversing that question of both being able to look at where you did belong, but then to contrarily say, hey, where is it where I feel like I don't belong? Because I think that the fear of not belonging is a great barrier to trust in our society among folks. Many of us have an instance where we felt like we didn't belong, and that eroded our trust. And trust, I think, is directly proportional to a sense of belonging. So if I could leave you all with anything, is the idea that your belonging is not in question. I tell people all the time, if you exist, that means every element in the known and unknown creation took a vote and said yes to you. And so then your work is to say yes to yourself and then create spaces where we can encourage others to say yes to themselves so that we can create systems that work for more people, if not all people. So does anyone else from the audience, for lack of a better term, the larger community, have anything they want to share before we give the panelists a final word? Don't see anything in the chat. All right, so given that, I wanted to open up the floor to the panelists to see if there's anything they would like to say as a final word, maybe a lesson you wish that you learned when you were younger, or anything on trust and how we can build trust in our communities, weaving, creating trust brokers, anything that speaks to you that you want to leave the group with.
I can go first.
Nice.
So I grew up in the Deep South, and I knew at a very young age that I was queer, and the community that I was a part of made it a really hard place to be queer and to be different in that way. But in my adult life, I've worked really hard and have been lucky to grow into a place where I can really celebrate who I am. And I'm also a poetry guy. My favorite poem is called Power by a queer poet, Adrienne Rich. But it talks about a concept I wish I'd known sooner. And it's basically that my queerness is actually the thing that makes me really strong. You know, it's the root of my identity, and it's the part of myself that helps me connect with others and to build trust. So that's something I wish I had known sooner.
Thank you. Shaylyn, you're off mute.
Sure. Thanks for sharing that, Cary. And I think that one thing that came out of my little breakout was a question about how do we transcend identity-based belonging and move into that space of belonging as something that already exists, right? And I think that I really appreciated the idea of spaces and containers being created where they can hold us in such a way that we can just show up fully without identities as sort of our calling card for belonging. Does that make sense? And so I think that those spaces are something that we can all work to create, but I also think that we can all work to open our hearts to be able to show up in that sort of a way. And I really believe that that's where the change that we all want to see is going to begin.
Thank you.
So I'll say it was our breakout session was such a really great experience. And so Jack and Shakira, shout out to you all for the great conversation and going deep really fast. I think I'd leave with the fact that, you know, you hear about all the problems that our communities are faced with all around the country. You hear it on the news, You hear it at the water cooler at work. You see it online in videos. And so the problems are vast. But I do want to remind you that each of us lives in a local community where each and every one of us can take a role in helping to knit back together our social fabric. It is where you live, it's where you buy groceries, it's where you send your kids to school. It's the most important role you have in your life outside of with your family is your community family. And so you all have the daunting task, and you can help to knit your community back together by getting involved, saying hello to your neighbor, having conversations with people, but really helping to broker, but also model what trust building looks like. And so I would almost, instead of a lasting comment, I would leave with the charge. The problems you see in your community, you be the person to go out and solve them. And one person can snowball this into a really big activity of how you can help to link and weave back to the social fabric of where you live.
So thank you. And thank to each of you, the panelists. We appreciate everything that you lifted up and shared, and most especially the modeling. That is critical to just demonstrate to people what it looks like. Just in this space alone, we've have a gamut of diversity, of experience and thought, and so many other expressions. And when we see that, when people see that, they then say, hey, I can see myself in that situation. And that's what we want to offer to people more and more. So I'm going to leave you before we go to the exchange, which I want to remind you that the exchange is happening right after this, and it's going to be facilitated by Dr. I hope I'm saying this right, Sherry or Cherry, I'm not sure which, but Sherry Hall Russell will be facilitating the exchange immediately following this, and there'll be a chance to continue engaging. And then I want to leave you these words from Audre Lorde, which are, you do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order for us to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. So with that, we thank everyone. Thank you again, folks, for putting your bodies in these spaces. It is not underestimated, it is valued. And every time you put your body in a space, you're creating a greater space for us all. So thank you. And have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the exchange.
So with that, I just want to again do the sort of things we have to do. Thank our sponsors. Really appreciate the support of Walmart, Allstate Foundation, the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, and AT&T for their support of this session. Also, the rest of our sponsors who make the entire year of Upswell happen for us. And please, 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 if you haven't already, consider joining us in Dallas, Fort Worth on November 15th through 17th for an in-person Upswell. I cannot tell you how engaging and amazing it is to be in real life with one another. I mean, these pop-ups were amazing and have been our way for us to connect through the pandemic. And we hope to continue them throughout, years to come. But this is the final one for 2023. And the staff here is gearing up for getting us all together in November. So please, please register. The early bird rates are here until the end of this month. So this is the time to get your cheapest ticket. So don't forget to go to independentsector.org and register for Upswell. And we'll have a lot of good announcements about speakers and sessions in the coming weeks. So check your inbox for that, check our website for that. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for sticking it out until the end. We really appreciate you, and have a great evening.